Hi. Good. I brushed my teeth not long ago. So, for this video, I want to discuss a trope I've seen in a lot of media and that I quite enjoyed the deconstruction of. If you don't know what a trope is, Google it. The trope in specific that I'm referring to has probably been talked about before. It's not exactly unnoticed, but I'm gonna go ahead and give it my own name because I haven't seen anyone else talk about it, and I want to give it a name. Fight me. So you ask, what name have I decided to give this trope? Why, only the lamest one I could think of, the opposing frenemies dynamic. So, what is this trope? And why have I spent the last 5 minutes trying to come up with a name for it? Let's get into it. So, opposing frenemies. That doesn't sound very complicated or like it will take the... how many paragraphs do I have planned? But, believe me, there's actually quite a bit to discuss. But before any of these 6 pages, let's cover the amount that takes about this much on the first page. Why should anyone care about what I have to say? Well, first off, and I don't know how many people are going to vibe with this, but for me, it's fun to dissect things for the point of dissecting them. I'm that type of person. Run off. Secondly, it also kind of acts as a justification. Don't say justification. Secondly, it also kind of acts as... Ow. Oh God, it hurts. Secondly, it also kind of acts as an explanation for those who don't know why fans tend to ship best friend and rival characters. And finally, being able to understand this trope can also help you sort of discern between and call out certain future aspects of the show, slash book, slash movie, whatever, that this trope belongs to, and kind of see where it's going. So back to the actual dynamic. There are 2 characters that you'll need to pay attention to. First off is Angst. I hate myself. These characters are often paired side by side and are understood through the lens of one another, and I shall be describing them as such. Angst is typically the dark-haired friend of the pair. They tend to be more quiet, more reserved, and more introverted. In terms of certain shows, this means that Angst will likely be more nerdy and or anxious, depending on the subject matter and what the author's into. In terms of fashion style, they can lean towards monochromatic and darker colors. Not gonna get a lot of bright colors with Angst, as is expected. Secondly, we have Sunflower. Sunflower, by contrast to Angst, is typically going to be the lighter-haired friend. This means if Angst has dark black hair, Sunflower is going to either have blonde or another form of brown. Anything that's lighter. This isn't always going to happen and to be followed, but it tends to. This friend tends to be more hyper, loud, outgoing, and extrovert. Fashion choice leans towards brighter and lighter colors, so you're not gonna get a lot of angsty fashion choices, unless it's a deliberate, workaround. An important thing to take note of is the sense of balance between the 2. That's why I drew them in a yin-yang here. Angst can tend to help Sunflower stay focused on more prevalent things, as well as dealing with a lot more of the heavier and darker concepts in the work. Angst does have a drawback, though, in terms that they can get too focused on the darker things and spiral a bit. Sunflower, by contrast, can draw Angst out of their shell a bit and make them focus on more positive things. The drawback here is that Sunflower can tend to forget to prioritize properly, or they can fail to realize how serious something actually is and, be a bit of a dumbass. I'm stressed. When played straight, and by that I mean in the most basic formation of it, it's basically an introvert's dream friendship. Like, You get this outgoing friend who's always ready to support you. They'll drag you out when you've been neglecting your social need and always be there for you. Sign me up, Jesus. I need that. Everyone needs that. Every introvert needs this. There is, however, a main issue to that format, and we'll see this in our examples later. The main issue being, audiences can sort of begin to question why these two are even friends, why Sunflower gives so much to Angst, but Angst doesn't really give anything back from what we can see. And especially since they're so dynamically opposed. If you don't build in a good groundwork of why these two care and balance one another out, it's going nowhere. And audiences can tend to sort of distance themselves from the concept. So first off, let's discuss stories where the main character is Angst. The first one that sort of springs to my mind when I think of this trope, and also the first time I noticed this trope, is The Chronicles of Vladimir Tod. Not an especially amazing book series. I quite enjoyed them when I was in elementary school. I'm sure if I went through them again nowadays, I'd have a few more issues with them. But I remember them being a quite fun read, and I liked their interpretation of vampires a lot. So, in this series, the main character, Vlad, is Angst. This is quite apparent as he is the vampire, so he kind of gets Angst points immediately. And the Sunflower in this is his best friend, who I believe the name of is Henry. So, Vlad and Henry are childhood friends. This is a very, very basic formation of this trope when Angst is the main character. They have a long-lasting friendship, and it's sort of based on longevity more than any other factor. Again, the main issue with this type of story is that audiences can question why these two are friends, but thankfully, this book series actually has Vlad dealing with that exact anxiety in, like, book 4? He worries about why Henry even hangs out with him at one point, actually tying it into a vampire mechanic in the story. But it addresses the main issue with this type of story between the characters, so that's cool. This is where we first encounter a common trope among the Sunflower variety. Henry gets mad at Vlad for keeping certain secrets. And this is a common Sunflower trope. Pay attention to this one. And finally, just to sort of vibe in what specifically about this relationship makes them this pairing and not just any other friendship. Alongside all of the traits that Vlad has that make him Angst, Henry is very supportive of Vlad almost throughout the entirety of the story. There are some bad times. And, really importantly, he always tries to get Vlad more involved with certain social groups. This is good. This is very basic, but still good. So, our second example, Tokyo Ghoul. So in this story, Kaneki is the Angst, while his best friend Hide is actually the one I named the Sunflower trope after. So Kaneki actually has quite a few of the more common Angst tropes. He is reserved, quiet, he reads books all the time, he has like one friend, total Angst. Also worth mentioning, dark hair versus light hair. So alongside Kaneki being very reserved socially, Hide also seems to be the one putting a lot more effort into the friendship. Again, we have a Angst character hiding or trying his best to hide his issues, burdens, and or just general secrets from the Sunflower. In this story, it's highly hinted that Hide knows, which is another common Sunflower thing. So far, we have Sunflower gets angry at secrets, and Sunflower secretly kind of knows the secrets. These are very, very common Sunflower traits when Angst is MC. So, again, the main issue with this style of this trope is, in essence, that audiences do begin to wonder why these two are so closely knit. Why do they care so much about each other when they're so different, when Sunflower puts in so much more work? It is a good concept and drama to explore in story. However, I myself personally maintain that it's better to just create reasoning for the characters to like each other in the first place. Because otherwise you may come into the question of, why were they good friends up to the point where they had to question this? Were there never any conflicts like this beforehand? However, even more importantly than that, it's just much more rewarding to see them like one another from the start and have that strong balance. At least in this type of story where Angst is the main character. Saying they're childhood friends doesn't really cover enough. And I do find that, unfortunately, that's where a lot of descriptions of why these two know each other and are so good of friends kind of just stop. Moving on, it's time to brighten up a bit, because it's time to discuss when Sunflower is the main character. It's actually really hot. I'm gonna take it off. So, what you may have noticed when we were discussing Angst MC stories is that they tend to be a lot darker in tone to sort of match Angst as the main character. It follows the exact opposite for when Sunflower's the main character, being that the stories will tend to be louder and more outgoing. In my examples, I noticed it was mainly either shonen or comedy. I'm sure if I looked into it, these shows also have brighter color palettes. They definitely do. Avatar: The Last Airbender. Obviously, Aang is the main character, and we're dealing with Sunflower as the main character in this one, so Aang. Who's Angst? Who, my friends, could possibly be Angst other than Zuko? He's perfect for this role. Let's get into it. So a common aspect of this trope you'll notice during the stories where Sunflower is the main character is that they tend to be closer to rivals than best friends for a good part of the story. That's why I called this the frenemies trope, because it involves both sides. So, Aang, he wears brighter clothes, he doesn't have hair, so we kind of negate it, and Zuko's is darker anyway, even when Aang does have hair. He's very hyper, he is a kid after all, he's very sociable, he loves people. Zuko, on the other hand, he wears darker clothing, he has a more rough, antisocial outlook, he is very awkward, and this is beautiful. He's also just like a bit of a dork, but under several layers, which is something I like seeing in an Angst character. So again, they're sort of enemies slash rivals at first, as is common. But as time goes on, Zuko switches sides and joins the gang. It ends up to be a more played straight sort of format of friendship, similar to more of a comedy dynamic than a action one. Aang starts to draw out Zuko's humor and lightens the mood, and Zuko tends to sort of stabilize the situation and focuses in on the need to be serious and on the stakes. So the last example I want to give for when Sunflower is the main character is Aron High School Host Club. Now I know that Haruhi is technically the main character of the show, but the pair I really want to focus on is Tamaki and Kyoya. Tamaki here is the Sunflower, Kyoya is his Angst, and what these two actually end up doing in this comedy show is they embody the perfect platonic power couple. Tamaki is the visionary of the group. He's the one who comes up with the ideas. They're always a bit naive, and he's trying his best to just throw anything out there. And Kyoya is the practical one who can make those ideas work. Similar to the played straight Angst main character format, the two sort of balance one another, and they bounce off one another in very interesting ways. Specifically, their strengths balance out their respective weaknesses. So Tamaki is very creative and outgoing, but he's kind of naive and illogical at times. Kyoya, meanwhile, is very intelligent and very practical. He hides behind a social facade for a good part of the show, and by that I mean he puts out a different exterior than what his interior is, which is a wonderful mess. As well, Kyoya kind of has no self-described motivations. When he meets Tamaki, after lots of weird mind games that only Kyoya is playing, Tamaki ends up giving Kyoya something unique and personal to do, instead of just following his father's whims all of his life. And Kyoya, in turn, makes Tamaki's weird ideas come true in a beautiful, beautiful platonic power couple manner. I love them. So, in general, they cancel out each other's flaws. So, that's all I got for fiction, but I'm a treat y'all. I write my own stories. I've only really recently started writing my own full-length novels that are actually going to be finished being written, and I am certain of this. But I've been working on this type of stuff for a long time, and I have progressed as a writer over the course of many years. So when I discuss my own examples of this character trope, because it is a character trope that is very near and dear to my heart, I have more nuanced examples, and this is gonna take a minute. So in the current book I am writing, Glitch, I utilize this trope in some more minor and some more major ways between different characters. An important note to make before we really dive into this is that I invert the hair color characteristic more often than I stick to it, for the sheer reason of subversion, I guess. So, Felix is my main character. I actually bought this turtleneck because it's what he wears. And Brody is his best friend. It's worth mentioning that by the point that they decide they're best friends of one another in the story, they've only known each other for less than a year. So, it's not one of those childhood best friend scenarios. Felix, in this case, is the angst, Brody is the sunflower. So Felix, as the main character, does the whole angst keeping secrets from sunflower trope. Brody is suspicious and hurt by the obvious secret keeping because it makes him feel like Felix doesn't trust him. As well as the fact that Brody is a huge worrier. So the fact that the secrets Felix are keeping are obviously hurting him and making things hard for him, that amps up his anxiety. So Felix and Brody are explained as caring for one another very deeply. Felix because in his crazy messed up life, Brody is basically the one anchor of normality that he can really hold on to. Brody, meanwhile, forms emotional attachments very easily and has a whole load of abandonment issues. Again, this is the sort of writing I prefer more, where their reasons for liking one another are based on their own character traits and what they personally need, rather than just, oh, they were childhood friends, so they've always been friends. Regarding the social aspect, Felix is a social mess, and Brody's kinda only more social by comparison to Felix. He's still typically more of an introvert though. However, he is the one to always initiate social interactions, both between the two and between them and other friends. So, another pair of best friends in my book are Jet and Miles. So in this scenario, Miles functions as the angst and Jet functions as the sunflower. Obviously, hair is not applicable, so Miles, as a bit of a twist on the angst, isn't so much reserved as he is majorly socially inept due to massive anger issues that stop him from liking too many people. So Jet, in opposition to most sunflowers, isn't exactly the most sociable by nature. I mean, compared to Miles, he might as well be a pro. But his sociability is not powered by an actual need for social investment. It's powered by a cool, easy facade of sociability that he uses to collect information primarily. He's slightly a sociopath, but that's a different matter. However, the reason he is a sunflower is because he is very easygoing, very calm, he's chill, but he still does not need to interact the same way most sunflowers do. So these two are actually childhood friends, but it's separated from the normal rationale of, oh, they've just always been friends. For these two specifically, it's not just that they were brought together and stayed together. They both felt too mature for their age, as Miles had gone through some pretty heavy trauma and felt socially isolated from other kids, as well as, growing a deep anger complex. Jet, meanwhile, was always a lot more intelligent than a lot of his peers and thus didn't really vibe with them the same level. Obviously, he vibed with Miles a lot more, so they decided to stay together as friends throughout the majority of their childhood on that rationale. So a distinction in this pair from a lot of other pairings is that they both keep secrets from one another. Jet, the sunflower, just likes to think he's better at it and that he can read Miles better than Miles can read him. So up to this point, I have been talking very specifically about best friends and rivals. However, it's important to note that this trope does not always function that way. And this is where we get into that justification for shipping characters. Because you'll be hard-pressed to find much of a difference between the way authors set up this dynamic between platonic friends and between romantic partners. So before really digging into the meat of this one, it's about time to address that in most straights-only media, this sort of dynamic is very commonly played between a male and a female character in sort of the vein of opposites attract. I mean, come on, just think of all the movies with young, perky, creative young women and just a grizzly, depressed dude who has dark hair, probably really handsome. It's not at all uncommon, and who can really blame creators? It's a really strong romantic dynamic. And this is honestly the exact reason a lot of fans ship same-sex best friends in a lot of media. It's because the trope can be used as both the groundwork for platonic pairings and romantic pairings. However, let's get into the meat of this example because I don't have time for straight people. In this scenario, Jet is actually the angst, and Brody is the sunflower again. Hair colors in this case actually do link to the trope since Jet is, dark hair, he also has darker fashion choices. Brody in general tends to wear lighter clothing, he has a bounce in his step, he's far more energetic. With Jet, he's actually drawn into the other boys' very cool, dark, mysterious aura because that's Brody's type. It's also worth mentioning intelligence is a big factor in their relationship, but we'll get into that in a minute. Jet, if you haven't already noticed, is a total punk. Ripped up clothes, silver piercings, big old black boots with chains on the wrong side just to piss people off. With Brody, Jet at first admires the boys' optimism and love for the city's vigilantes, especially when he sticks up for them against Miles' own cynicism of them. Slowly, this is the cute bit, he also begins to find Brody's smiles and over-exaggerated nature very endearing and cute. So, Jet, as aforementioned, keeps secrets. He basically is just a giant secret at this point. Brody, as aforementioned, hates secrets. Instead of this becoming a conflict between the two, however, Jet actually lets Brody in on it and they become the ultimate power couple. They meet in story, so no explanations to their past needs to be given, and their progression from friends to boyfriends is built up in story. You see Brody's crush forming and how awkward he is, and you can see Jet beginning to lean into it a bit as well. It's just built into their character designs too. Jet loves information. It's his job. Brody is the only character in the story asking the right questions half the time. All of this makes their opposite dynamic a big bit stronger than the other opposite pairs I have in this story. So, as a final note, a final example from my own repertoire, I want to talk about one of my early story concepts, because I still really love the characters, but I didn't do enough to really sell it. So, let's go back in time to the first story I tried to write on my own, Resurrection of the Dead. So, in this story, Caden Shaw is my main character, and I still love him as a main character, but he was honestly a bit of a mess in his first interpretation. He acts as the angst. This is one of those stories. His best friend Justin acts as the sunflower. So Caden is not all that socially capable throughout the majority of the story. Specifically for Caden, his condition leaves him unable to really express emotions properly. It's a nightmare. Justin is far more apparently sociable, constant worry for his best friend tying him to Caden alongside longevity. This is a childhood friend scenario where they were just kind of friends from childhood. Again, not strong writing, and I'm saying this because I want to make clear that I don't always get it right. I'm not going to debase others without debasing myself. So, as you can see this going, it falls pretty heavily into the trap of, why on earth are these two friends? Because, it does seem like a lot of extra trouble that otherwise wouldn't be worth it. They're not getting anything out of it, and in this type of situation, getting something out of the friendship is actually incredibly important. They need to have a tangible balance to the relationship for it to really be at its strongest. When I later realized that this was an issue, I attempted to fix it by making Justin more socially disconnected as well. Meaning, despite having a lot of friends, he doesn't value those friendships nearly as much as he does Caden, simply because he has a closer bond. This is an okay fix, but there is an inherent issue with it. The issue being that instead of strengthening one another through the formation of this bond, it's now instead become codependent, and both characters have to be actually broken in order for it to work. This sort of negative example actually goes to show how important it is that the characters balance one another out. The entire reason why the dynamic works, why people want to use it, is because the use of the dynamic, by having the characters do this little dance, it just strengthens them. It's supposed to. It turns Jet and Brody into a power couple romantically, and it does the same for Tamaki and Kyoya platonically. And it can for so many other pairs too. That is like the heightened advantage of this type of storytelling, of this trope, is that it can make the characters unstoppable together. When the trope makes characters broken and codependent, you've balanced it in the wrong direction. Like, in real life, we would call that toxic, you know? So, the point. What's the point of all of this? Why have I spent several hours ranting to my camera taped up to a tripod in my room? And honestly, I just like the trope. And obviously we give a lot of cadence to it in real life as well. Like, it is an actual saying that opposites attract. I don't put so much stake in that phrase as I do some others, but it exists for a reason. And I think the important thing to take out of it is not that people who are different are going to be friends, but that if you can find a relationship where you balance one another out, that's a keeper. And also, since my dad says I should make YouTube videos for a living, yes, this was a thing he said. Monster, please sponsor me. Please. Please. Please.